He had imagined her petite and delicate, with gentle hands that would tend his garden and soft words that would fill the silence of his lonely ranch. But when the dust settled from the wagon wheels rolling across the scorching July Dakota territory, Marcus Webb found himself staring up at a woman who could probably lift him with one arm. Sarah McKnight stood exactly 6 feet 3 inches tall in her worn boots, with shoulders broader than most men in town and hands that looked like they could handle a plow better than a teacup. The letter in Marcus's pocket suddenly felt like a cruel joke, and the wedding ring he had carved from oak seemed impossibly small. But the real shock was just beginning. 3 months earlier, Marcus had placed his advertisement in the territorial newspaper with shaking hands. Honest rancher seeks gentle companion for frontier life. Must appreciate simple pleasures and quiet evenings. He had received only one response, a carefully written letter that spoke of loneliness matching his own. Sarah's letters had painted pictures of cozy meals and shared conversations, of someone who understood the weight of solitude that pressed down on isolated homesteads. Never once had she mentioned that she stood taller than his barn door. Fletcher Knox, the merchant who had arranged the meeting, cleared his throat nervously as he climbed down from the wagon driver's seat. His eyes darted between Marcus's stunned expression and Sarah's imposing figure. The woman herself seemed equally surprised, her confident posture faltering as she took in Marcus's slight frame and the way he had to crane his neck to meet her gaze. For a moment the three of them stood frozen in the dusty yard like actors who had forgotten their lines. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. Marcus felt the curious stares of his neighbors who had gathered to witness the arrival of his mail-order bride. Mrs. Henderson from the general store whispered something to her husband behind her hand. Young Tommy Morrison actually pointed before his mother yanked his arm down. The whole scene felt like a public spectacle gone wrong, and Marcus's cheeks burned with embarrassment that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. What he didn't know was that this humiliation was nothing compared to what was coming when the truth about Sarah's past finally emerged. Sarah finally spoke, her voice deeper than he had expected but not unkind. "You must be Marcus." She extended a hand that engulfed his own when he reluctantly offered it. Her grip was firm but careful, as if she was aware of her own strength. "I suppose we should talk." The way she said it suggested she was having the same doubts that were racing through his mind. Fletcher Knox sensed the tension and quickly busied himself unloading Sarah's single trunk from the wagon bed. It was larger than Marcus had anticipated, reinforcing the growing realization that nothing about this arrangement was going to match his expectations. But what Fletcher didn't mention was that he'd been paid triple his usual fee to arrange this particular meeting, and the money had come from sources that asked no questions. The merchant's hurried movements betrayed his own discomfort with the awkward situation he had helped create. But as Marcus watched Sarah survey his modest ranch with what appeared to be genuine interest rather than disappointment, something unexpected happened. She didn't wrinkle her nose at the simple cabin or the patches in the corral fence. Instead, she nodded approvingly at his well-tended vegetable garden and the neat stack of firewood by the porch. Her eyes lingered on the positioning of his buildings, the sightlines to the main road, the way the corrals were arranged for quick access. Most women would notice the flowers he'd planted by the door or the fresh coat of paint on the shutters. Sarah was cataloging defensive positions and escape routes. Whatever shock she felt at his appearance, she was keeping it to herself with a grace he hadn't expected from someone who looked like she could break him in half. But the real test would come the next morning, and with it the first glimpse of exactly who Sarah McKnight really was. The morning after Sarah's arrival brought a crisis that neither of them had anticipated. Marcus's prize bull, Dakota, had somehow broken through the reinforced fence during the night and was now standing defiantly in the middle of Mrs. Henderson's prized flower garden 3 properties over. The massive animal was systematically destroying months of careful cultivation, and the sound of Mrs. Henderson's furious shouting could be heard clear across the valley. Marcus stood at his porch railing, wringing his hands as he watched the disaster unfold. Dakota weighed nearly 2,000 pounds and had the temperament of a storm cloud on the best of days. The bull had already charged 2 of the neighbormen who had tried to approach, sending them scrambling over fences in an undignified retreat. The situation was quickly becoming the kind of neighborhood scandal that would follow Marcus for years. "You can't rope him from here," Sarah observed calmly from beside him. She had appeared at his elbow without him noticing, moving with surprising quiet for someone her size. Her eyes were fixed on the bull with an expression that Marcus couldn't quite read. "And those men down there are going to get themselves trampled if they keep approaching from the front like that." Marcus nodded miserably. "Dakota's always been stubborn, but never like this. I don't know what got into him." The truth was, he had been dreading this exact scenario since the day he bought the bull.
He had neither the physical strength nor the experience to handle such a large animal when it decided to be uncooperative. Most of his neighbors knew it, which made the current situation even more humiliating. Without warning, Sarah stepped off the porch and began walking toward the chaos with long, purposeful strides. But there was something different about her movement now, a predatory grace that hadn't been there the day before. Marcus hurried after her, his shorter legs working double time to keep up. "Sarah, wait. He's dangerous when he's agitated like this. You shouldn't," but she was already halfway across the field, her attention focused entirely on the rampaging bull. What Marcus couldn't see was the way her hand instinctively checked her hip, as if reaching for something that should have been there. As they approached Mrs. Henderson's property, Marcus could see the full extent of the damage. Roses that had taken 3 years to establish were trampled into the dirt. The carefully arranged border stones had been scattered like toys. Mrs. Henderson herself stood on her front steps, her face red with fury, directing a stream of accusations at anyone within earshot. When she spotted Marcus approaching, her voice rose another octave. "That monster of yours has destroyed everything," she shrieked. "Look at my garden. Just look at it. You're going to pay for every single plant, Marcus Webb, and if you can't control your livestock, you have no business keeping them." The other neighbors nodded in agreement, their expressions ranging from sympathetic to openly hostile. But what they didn't notice was how Sarah's eyes swept the crowd, cataloging faces, noting who carried weapons, assessing threat levels with the automatic precision of someone who had learned survival the hard way. Sarah ignored the commotion entirely. She studied Dakota's movements with the kind of focused attention usually reserved for reading difficult text. The bull was pawing the ground near what remained of a rose bush, his massive head lowered in a way that suggested he was preparing for another charge. 2 more men had arrived with ropes, but they stood at a safe distance, clearly reluctant to get within range of those wicked-looking horns. Then Sarah did something that made Marcus's heart stop. She climbed over the fence and began walking directly toward the agitated animal, her hands empty and her movements slow but confident. The crowd fell silent, watching in fascination and horror as this impossibly tall woman approached the beast that had sent grown men running for cover. Even Mrs. Henderson stopped her tirade, her mouth hanging open in disbelief. Dakota's massive head swung toward Sarah as she approached, his nostrils flaring with each heavy breath. The bull's eyes rolled wide at the edges, a sure sign of an animal pushed beyond reason. Marcus felt his throat constrict as he watched his mail-order bride walk calmly into what looked like certain death. Every instinct screamed at him to call out, to stop her, but something in her deliberate movements kept him frozen in place. There was a confidence there that spoke of experience with dangerous situations, though he couldn't imagine where a ranch girl from Montana would have gained such nerve. Sarah began speaking to the bull in a low, steady voice that carried just far enough for Marcus to catch fragments. She wasn't using the sharp, commanding tone most people employed with livestock. Instead, her words flowed like water over stones, rhythmic and soothing. But what struck Marcus as odd was that some of the words she spoke weren't English. They sounded foreign, possibly Spanish, delivered with a fluency that suggested she'd learned them somewhere far from any Montana cattle ranch. Dakota's ears twitched forward and his pawing gradually slowed. The crowd of onlookers held their collective breath as woman and beast regarded each other across 10 feet of trampled garden. "Easy there, big fellow," Sarah murmured, extending one hand palm up in Dakota's direction. "You're not really angry, are you? Just confused and far from home." The words held a gentleness that seemed to resonate with something deeper than simple animal training. Marcus found himself wondering if she was speaking as much to herself as to the bull. She took another step closer, and Marcus's heart hammered against his ribs. The bull could charge at any moment, and there was nowhere for her to run in Mrs. Henderson's enclosed garden space. But Dakota didn't charge. Instead, something extraordinary happened. The massive animal's breathing began to even out, and his aggressive posture relaxed incrementally. Sarah continued her approach, never breaking eye contact, never hurrying her movements. When she was close enough to touch him, she reached out and placed her hand on his enormous neck right behind his left ear. The gesture was practiced, professional, the kind of touch that spoke of years working with animals much more dangerous than farm cattle. The effect was immediate and startling. Dakota's head dropped lower, and a sound that was almost like a sigh escaped from his chest. Sarah began scratching behind his ear with practiced fingers, and the bull actually leaned into her touch like an oversized dog seeking affection. The transformation was so complete that several people in the crowd gasped audibly. "Someone fetch a lead rope," Sarah called over her shoulder without taking her eyes off Dakota. Her voice carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed in life-or-death situations. Fletcher Knox scrambled to comply, returning quickly with a length of sturdy rope from Marcus's barn. Sarah fashioned a simple halter with movements so smooth they seemed rehearsed, her fingers working the knots with a speed and precision that suggested she'd done this countless times before. Within minutes she was leading Dakota out of the ruined garden as docilely as a lamb. The bull followed her without resistance, his earlier aggression completely forgotten. The assembled neighbors parted like water before them, their faces showing a mixture of amazement and bewilderment. Mrs. Henderson stood speechless on her porch steps, her prepared speech about livestock control dying unspoken on her lips. As they passed Marcus, Sarah caught his eye and offered a small smile that transformed her entire face. For the first time since her arrival, he saw past her intimidating size to something warmer underneath. But there was also something else there, a shadow of secrets that made him wonder what other surprises his mail-order bride might be hiding. "Your fence has a weak post on the north corner," she said casually, as if taming rampaging bulls was something she did every morning before breakfast. "We should probably fix that before he decides to take another walk." But when the townspeople saw Sarah's feat with the bull, what they started saying about her would never prepare Marcus for what was coming. Word of Sarah's feat with the bull spread through the settlement faster than wildfire in dry grass. By afternoon, a steady stream of neighbors had found excuses to visit Marcus's ranch, their curiosity barely concealed behind offers of welcome meals and gardening advice. Each visitor cast furtive glances at Sarah as she worked alongside Marcus to repair the damaged fence, their whispered conversations creating an undercurrent of speculation that made him increasingly uncomfortable. The attention reached a peak when Samuel Morrison arrived with his 3 sons in tow, ostensibly to help with the fence work, but clearly more interested in getting a closer look at the woman who had tamed Dakota with her bare hands. Morrison was the kind of man who measured everything by physical strength and found Marcus lacking in most departments. His presence always made Marcus feel smaller than he already was. "Heard your lady friend has a way with livestock," Morrison commented, leaning against the fence post with studied casualness. His boys arranged themselves behind him like an audience, their eyes fixed on Sarah as she drove fence posts into the hard ground with powerful swings of a heavy sledgehammer. Each blow sent the post deeper than Marcus could have managed with twice as many swings. But what caught Morrison's attention wasn't just her strength, it was the rhythm of her strikes, the efficient economy of movement that spoke of training beyond simple farm work. Marcus felt heat creep up his neck as Morrison's implications became clear. The man was questioning whether Marcus could provide for and protect a woman of Sarah's obvious capabilities. It was the same doubt that had been gnawing at his own confidence since her arrival, but hearing it voiced by someone else made it sting twice as sharp. "Sarah grew up on a cattle ranch in Montana," Marcus replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "She knows her way around animals." It was true as far as it went, though he had learned this fact only that morning when she mentioned it while examining Dakota's temperament. Her letters had spoken of wanting a quiet life, but they had never detailed the experiences that had shaped her into someone capable of handling a 2,000-pound bull without breaking a sweat. Morrison's eldest son, a strapping young man of 19, stepped forward with the kind of confidence that came from never having been physically challenged by life. "Maybe she'd like some help with that post-hole digger," he offered, his voice carrying the assumption that his assistance would be both welcome and necessary. "Looks like heavy work for," he trailed off, apparently realizing that commenting on Sarah's gender might not be wise, given what they had all witnessed that morning. Sarah looked up from her work, sweat glistening on her forehead despite the relatively cool temperature. Her expression was polite but distant as she considered the young man's offer. For just a moment, Marcus caught something in her eyes that reminded him of a wolf evaluating whether something posed a threat. "I appreciate the thought," she said, "but I've got my rhythm now. Might be better if you helped Marcus with stretching the wire." Her tone was perfectly pleasant, but there was something in it that discouraged further offers of assistance. The rejection stung the boy's pride in a way that was immediately visible. His shoulders stiffened and his jaw clenched as he realized that this unusual woman had no need for his strength or protection. Morrison's other sons exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their collective confusion regarding the proper social dynamics of the situation. Marcus watched the interaction with growing unease. He could see the wheels turning in Morrison's head, the calculations being made about power and perception and community standing. Men like Morrison lived by clear rules about who was strong and who was weak, who led and who followed. Sarah's presence disrupted those rules in ways that made some people uncomfortable. But what troubled Marcus most was his own reaction. Part of him was proud of Sarah's competence and independence. Another part wondered if her strength highlighted his own inadequacies in ways that would become impossible to ignore. As the afternoon wore on, more neighbors arrived. The Peterson family brought fresh bread, though Martha Peterson spent more time staring at Sarah than making conversation. Old Henrik Larsson claimed he needed to borrow a tool, but lingered for nearly an hour watching Sarah work. Each visitor brought questions, veiled behind pleasantries but persistent nonetheless. Where exactly in Montana was she from? Did she have family there still? What had brought her so far from home to answer a mail-order bride advertisement? Sarah deflected the inquiries with practiced ease, offering just enough information to seem forthcoming while revealing nothing of substance. Marcus began to notice the pattern, the way she could talk for minutes without saying anything meaningful about her past. It was the kind of skill that came from a lifetime of hiding secrets. That evening, as the last of the curious neighbors finally departed, Marcus found himself alone with Sarah for the first time since her arrival. The silence between them felt heavier than the humid air that preceded a thunderstorm. They sat on opposite ends of his small porch, the space between them measured not just in feet, but in the weight of unspoken doubts and mismatched expectations. Sarah broke the silence first, her voice carrying a weariness that hadn't been there when she faced down the bull. "This isn't what either of us expected, is it?" She wasn't looking at him as she spoke, but rather staring out at the darkening horizon where the first stars were beginning to appear. Her profile was strong and angular, nothing like the delicate features he had imagined during those long months of correspondence. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair, the wood creaking under his slight weight. "I should have been more specific in my letters," he admitted, though even as he said it, he wasn't sure what exactly he could have written. That he was shorter than most men, that he sometimes felt lost on his own ranch, that he had placed the advertisement not out of confidence, but out of desperate loneliness. About what? Sarah turned to face him, and her directness caught him off guard. About being shorter than average, about having neighbors who measure a man's worth by how much weight he can lift. There was no mockery in her voice, but there was a sharp understanding that made Marcus wonder what experiences had taught her to recognize such things so quickly. The kind of understanding that came from being judged, from being underestimated, from learning to read people as a matter of survival. The honesty in her question demanded an equally honest response. "About feeling like I'm not enough," he said quietly. "Not strong enough, not big enough, not man enough for this life I'm trying to build." The admission hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire, acrid and impossible to take back. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming a slow rhythm against the arm of her chair. When she finally spoke, her voice held a gentleness that surprised him. "You know what I saw today when you watched me with Dakota?" She didn't wait for his answer. "I saw a man who cared more about my safety than his own embarrassment. Most men would have stopped me, would have insisted on handling it themselves, even if they got hurt in the process." Marcus felt something loosen in his chest, though he wasn't sure if it was relief or something more complicated. "And what I should have written," Sarah continued, "was that I'm tired of being seen as a curiosity or a challenge, that I've spent my whole life having people assume I must be looking for someone to prove their strength against mine." She paused, her fingers still drumming that absent rhythm. "What I should have told you is that I'm running from something, that the woman who answered your advertisement isn't exactly who she claimed to be." The words sent a chill down Marcus's spine that had nothing to do with the evening air. "What do you mean?" Sarah stood abruptly, pacing to the edge of the porch where the shadows were deeper. "My name is Sarah McKnight. That part's true. But I wasn't raised on a cattle ranch in Montana. I was raised in a dozen different places by people who taught me that survival meant never staying in one place too long, never trusting anyone completely, and never letting anyone get close enough to hurt you." She turned back to face him, and in the dim light, Marcus could see the pain etched in her features. "The people who raised me weren't ranchers, Marcus. They were outlaws, bank robbers, train thieves, confidence artists. They took in strays like me because children made excellent cover and better pickpockets." The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. Everything he thought he knew about this woman was crumbling around him. "Then how did I end up answering a mail-order bride advertisement?" Sarah's laugh held no humor. "Because 3 months ago, the gang I'd been riding with for the past 5 years got themselves killed in a job gone wrong. All of them except me, because I was smart enough to stay with the horses instead of walking into what was obviously a trap." She sank back down into her chair, suddenly looking older than her years. "I found myself alone for the first time in my life, with a price on my head and nowhere to go. Your advertisement wasn't looking for a wife, Marcus. It was looking for a place to disappear." The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus felt as if the ground had shifted beneath his feet, leaving him scrambling for purchase in a world that no longer made sense. "So everything you wrote in your letters," he said slowly, "about wanting a quiet life, about understanding loneliness, was true," Sarah said firmly. "Every word of it. The loneliness of never being able to trust anyone, of always having to watch your back, of knowing that everyone you care about will eventually leave or get themselves killed. That's the most honest thing I've ever told anyone. Marcus stared at her, trying to reconcile this revelation with the woman who had gently calmed his bull, who had worked beside him all day without complaint, who had looked at his modest ranch with genuine appreciation rather than disappointment. Are there people looking for you?" he asked. Sarah nodded grimly. "Probably. The law for sure, maybe some of the families of people we robbed, maybe other gangs who knew about the gold we were carrying when everyone else got killed. Gold, $20,000 worth hidden where only I know how to find it." Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper, enough to start a new life somewhere far from here, if I can stay alive long enough to retrieve it. The magnitude of what she was telling him began to sink in. Marcus had invited a wanted fugitive into his home, into his life, into his heart. The woman he was planning to marry was carrying secrets that could get them both killed. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. Sarah met his gaze directly. "Because you deserve to know what you'd be getting into. Because if we're going to make this work, it has to be built on honesty, not the lies I told in my letters." She took a shaky breath. "And because I think I might be falling in love with you, and I couldn't live with myself if something happened to you because of who I used to be." The confession hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they were brave enough to cross. Marcus found himself at a crossroads he never could have imagined when he placed that simple advertisement in the newspaper. He could ask her to leave, to take her secrets and her danger, and disappear into the night. It would be the safe choice, the sensible choice, the choice that would protect his quiet life and his respectable standing in the community. Or he could choose to see past the revelations to the woman who had shown him nothing but kindness, who had worked beside him without complaint, who had looked at his modest achievements with genuine respect rather than disappointment. "The gold," he said finally. "Where is it?" Sarah's eyes widened in surprise. "Marcus, you can't be thinking—" "Where is it?" he repeated, his voice stronger now. "Hidden in a cave about a day's ride north of here, marked by 3 lightning-struck trees in a triangle." She searched his face desperately. "But Marcus, if we go after it, if anyone sees us or follows us, it could mean freedom," Marcus interrupted. "Real freedom to start over wherever we want, however we want." He stood up, pacing to where she sat. "Or it could mean staying here, and always wondering when your past is going to catch up with us." Sarah stared at him as if seeing him for the first time. "You're talking about becoming an outlaw yourself, about throwing away everything you've built here." "I'm talking about choosing the woman I love over the life I thought I wanted," Marcus said, surprised by the certainty in his own voice. "I'm talking about finally taking a risk that matters." For the first time since he'd known her, Sarah McKnight looked truly vulnerable. Tears gathered in her eyes as she reached for his hands. "You don't know what you're saying. You don't know what that life is like. Always running, never settling down, never knowing who you can trust." "Then teach me," Marcus said simply. "You spent today teaching me about my own bull, about fixing fences, about being strong in ways I never knew existed. Teach me how to survive whatever's coming." Sarah studied his face in the moonlight, looking for any sign of doubt or fear. What she found instead was a determination she'd never seen before, a quiet strength that had nothing to do with physical size or conventional masculinity. "If we do this," she said slowly, "there's no going back. Once we retrieve that gold, we'll have to disappear. New names, new lives, always looking over our shoulders. And if we don't do it, we'll spend the rest of our lives waiting for your past to find us anyway," Marcus pointed out. "At least this way, we'll have the resources to stay ahead of it." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming that familiar rhythm against his palm. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady. "We'll need supplies, horses that can travel fast and far, and we'll need to move before word spreads too much about my oldie nobilities with livestock. People are already talking, asking questions." Marcus felt his pulse quicken as the reality of what they were planning began to sink in. "When?" "Tomorrow night, under cover of darkness." Sarah's transformation was visible, the vulnerable woman of moments before replaced by someone harder, more calculating. "Can you be ready?" Marcus thought about his modest ranch, his carefully tended garden, his place in the small community that had been his entire world for the past 3 years. Then he looked at the woman beside him, really seeing her for perhaps the first time, not the delicate companion he'd imagined, not even the strong frontier woman he'd begun to fall for, but someone infinitely more complex and dangerous and real. "I'll be ready," he said. What neither of them could have known was that their conversation had been overheard, that curious ears were always listening in small frontier communities, and that by morning their carefully laid plans would face a challenge that would test not just their courage, but the very foundation of the trust they were trying to build. but that revelation would have to wait until the sun rose on what might be their last day as respectable citizens of the Dakota Territory. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where unexpected encounters change everything on the wild frontier. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.